When you step outside this building, what makes you feel you're in Helsingborg and not somewhere else? Well, the languages and dialects you hear might give you a sense of what region we're in, particularly here in Skåne, where the dialect is very easy to recognize, even if it isn't always easy to understand. But I think it's architecture that is the most telling. The articulation of the facades, the rhythm of the skyline, the tone of the materials. This is architecture's version of a local accent, a vernacular. You don't have to be a qualified architect to instinctively be able to tell the differences between Helsingborg's red brick architecture and Stockholm's elegant waterfronts in those yellows and ochres that pick up the northern light, or Gothenburg's avenues made from the granite and the wood from surrounding mountains and forests. The traditional architecture of Skåne, the region that connects Helsingborg with where I work in Malmö, is rooted in its geography. The ingredients come from the landscape around us, the bricks from the clay under our feet, bonded together using lime from local quarries, held up using half timbering from limited supplies of local trees. Even the form of the buildings is shaped by our climate. So the long, low buildings with steep pitched roofs huddled together to give us shelter from the infamous wind and rain. And the crafts and techniques in this architecture are inherited from a long history of cultural exchange with our neighbors in Denmark and northern Germany. The specific conditions of this place, the landscape, the climate, the culture, have shaped a specific architecture that has a strong sense of place, that strengthens our sense of belonging. But over time, the ties between architecture and place have loosened. The way we build today is less reliant on the resources close at hand. And as a result, we have architecture that too often dilutes our sense of place and dilutes our sense of belonging. Take the lime that was used in that traditional architecture in Malmö. It came mostly from this mine in Limhamn. By the late 1800s, Skånska Cementgjuteriet had begun to exploit this mine and export the materials to other cities in Sweden. By the late 1900s, when Skånska Cementgjuteriet had become the multinational Skanska, the Swedish construction industry had undergone a process of radical centralization and standardization. Housing today in Sweden has more to do with national standards, international investment, and global supply chains than our local conditions. And much of it looks like this. So I'm going to give you a little quiz here. Which one of these new buildings is in Helsingborg? Just shout out. Any guesses? Bottom left? I'm afraid it's bottom right. Okay, which one of these new buildings is in Stockholm? Any guesses? Shout out. Top right, middle left. Okay, last one. Which one of these is in Gothenburg? All of them. Very good response. It could be, but it's only the one in the bottom middle. You get the picture. I've actually done this test on developers who haven't even recognized their own projects. In Sweden, we call this development blandstad or mixed use. And whenever I hear this phrase, I can't help thinking of the English meaning of the word bland. Because this architecture is fundamentally generic. It's architecture that we often find ways of finding variation to. For example, changing the materials every few meters, even though the building behind it is actually the same thing. I've even heard developers explain the logic behind this by saying, well, if it was all one architecture, then it might be ugly. But if we mix it up into smaller bits, then people are distracted by the variation. In my view, if you break up generic architecture into smaller bits, it's still generic architecture. Variation is no compensation for a lack of quality. I particularly like this example because if you zoom in on the ground floor here, you see there's a shop trying to sell timber windows, and they say, increase the value and beauty of your home with real timber windows and doors. And of course, you can't escape the irony that this isn't a building that decided not to invest in timber windows and doors. And in a way, it's the perfect advert for their products. So when so much of this stuff is going up around the country, I can understand it when many people and politicians are calling for something different. If we're not convinced about the direction that architecture's heading in, then it's a kind of natural knee-jerk reaction to want to rewind the clock to a time when people felt more of a connection with place. Unfortunately, the challenge we're facing goes deeper than facades. It's structural. The solution can't simply be to superimpose old styles onto new development when the question we're facing is a more fundamental one. How do we reconnect architecture to place to build a new sense of belonging? Why don't we then just go back to making Skåne half timbered again? Well, because those local conditions change over time. Architecture that made sense to communities 400 years ago doesn't necessarily make sense to our communities today. The beautiful thing about local dialects is that they continue to evolve. New slang emerges, pronunciation shifts. My own neighborhood in Malmö, Rosengård, developed its own dialect in the space of a few decades. And that's also a way of building a sense of belonging. I think architecture, like dialects, should continue to evolve because we need to maintain that connection between citizens and their city. And I'm going to talk about 3 ways we can make new architectural vernaculars that make sense for today. The first is that we need to reconnect who builds to our local economies. The Swedish construction industry is dominated by a small number of large players who hold a lot of influence. And it's a bit like our food industry here in Sweden, where 90% of our groceries are bought from just 3 companies. It tends to result in narrower choice, higher prices, and higher barriers to entry for new competitors. It also results in lower quality because whilst the top-heavy housing industry is good at maintaining minimum standards, there are few incentives to go beyond those minimums. Architects hold relatively little power in relation to the developers they work for. And too often they find themselves in a role that's flattened to colouring in the facades of a developer's ready-made product. Too often they find their ambitions eroded by cost-cutting decisions further down the construction process, to the extent that in some cases like this one, they even disown the results. Look at the differences when housing in the same material, in the same city, at around the same price, is not only designed, but also delivered by architects. This is Iggy by Siegel, one of a growing number of architect developers from Malmö, who are taking on house builders at their own game and showing them up. The city of Malmö is making smaller plots of public land available to new entrants like architects, developers, and community-led groups. And the results are consistently more ambitious, more sustainable, and less generic. In Malmö, we're starting to see this new generation of locally based, smaller scale developers challenging the big house builders to up their game. Secondly, we need to reconnect what we build with to our local resources. The Swedish house building industry relies heavily on standardized construction systems. Things like precast concrete panels with the joints still showing, although occasionally half hidden by a drain pipe, small windows stuck on balconies, deck access to save on the costs of internal corridors. This is lowest common denominator architecture that has more to do with the factory it's prefabricated in than the place it will stand for decades, if not longer. The alternative lies elsewhere in Malmö, Varvstaden. This is the heart of Malmö's old shipping industry, where 80% of the old sheds and warehouses are being retained and renewed or reused, saving an estimated 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Any materials here that are dismantled are being carefully logged and stored in this vast material bank, which is the first place architects look when it comes to designing new buildings. So instead of ordering brand new materials from abroad where they're extracted and manufactured and shipped to Malmö, materials here as far as possible are locally sourced. And they're reusing everything from metal cladding to bricks to windows, staircases and lighting. They're even reusing these giant steel trusses that were once 30 meters in the sky to hold up a new office building. This circular approach of working with what we already have doesn't just save carbon, it also gives the new architecture, like these headquarters for Oatly, designed by Kjellander Sjöberg architects, a kind of here-ness. It belongs in Varvstaden because it's made in Varvstaden. And I think this is the beginning of a kind of revolution in resources. In the future, more and more of our materials will have to be sourced locally from within cities and their surrounding region. Those old brickworks and chalk mines will need to be replaced by new circular local supply chains that in turn will feed new local vernaculars. Finally, we need to connect who designs our built environment with local expertise and experience. When I moved to Sweden 2 years ago, I heard a lot about Malmö being the most diverse city in Sweden. And at the latest count, we have 186 different nationalities. Over half of our population has a foreign background, making Malmö one of the only cities in Europe that is technically super diverse, alongside London and Amsterdam. In other words, we are a majority of minorities. But when I started working here, that image wasn't necessarily reflected in a lot of the meetings and events that I found myself in. And of course, you can't just judge diversity by appearances. There are many more dimensions to it than that. But I certainly felt there was a problem when I realized that I, as a white, straight, middle-class man, was actually increasing the diversity in some rooms purely because I was the only person not from the EU. And even that's only thanks to Brexit. This is a problem not just because it's unfair. It's fundamental to how we build places that society, and I mean all of today's society, feels a belonging to. Because when we design, we're inevitably influenced by and limited by our own personal experiences. I've certainly been involved in projects in the past where unconsciously we've planned places in our own image, what I would call a kind of flat white urbanism that might work for me, but not necessarily other people. If we're serious about breaking that aesthetic homogeneity in Sweden, we also need to look at how we can change the demographic homogeneity in the industry. Sweden's done this before when it comes to gender equality. Now it's time to be equally ambitious about how we deal with different dimensions of diversity. That's why in Malmö, we've started up an initiative called Urban Academy, which for the first time is actually gathering data on how representative the architecture industry here really is, where there are barriers to entering the profession, and developing a range of measures about how we can break down those barriers for people from underrepresented groups. People like Duha Altai here, who grew up in Malmö but is studying in Lund, and told me that her and her friends are assuming that the only way they're going to be able to get a job is going to the Middle East because they can't see how they can fit into the built environment industry here. This is a brain drain of exactly the expertise we need most in Malmö. It's a waste of the talent that's on the city's own doorstep. But things are starting to change. This is Haidar Al-Wad in the suit. He moved to Malmö aged 9 from Iraq and grew up in this area, Lindängen. When he went to speak to his school teacher, his careers advisor at school, and said he wanted to be an architect, he was laughed at. But he persevered, and despite the odds, he made it. Last week, Haidar went back to Lindängen to speak to kids there about becoming an architect. And at the end of the session, this boy came up to him and said, before he dreamed of becoming an astronaut, but now he was thinking about becoming an architect. The lack of representation in the industry is obviously not going to change overnight through one child's choice or one pilot project. But through Urban Academy, we're starting to build a sector coalition committed to making Malmö's built environment industry more reflective of the communities we serve. I'm proud to work in a city where our local national dish is the falafel. And I think you can taste Malmö's contemporary culture in our food. I think you can hear it in our music. I think you can see it in the work of our up-and-coming fashion designers, photographers, and filmmakers. Now it's time to build it into our architecture. And I'm really hopeful about the new directions that's going to take architecture in Malmö. But I'm also hopeful about where it's going to take other cities. Because wherever we are, I think we can dig deeper to find those unique local conditions, from our local economies to our local resources to our local expertise, and express that in what we build. New vernacular architectures that we all feel we can belong to. Thank you.